Hello and welcome. Thank you to all of you for joining us today for the first of our Ask the Engineers sessions, looking at the COP26 summit, which starts next month in Glasgow. Now, governments all over the world are setting net zero targets, but how will they actually achieve these things in practice? The engineering profession is clearly a massive part of that how, and engineers are actively developing ways to reduce carbon emissions all around the world. And this is how the actual procedure of net zero will actually be made in real life. Now, we're delighted to be working with Arup as our technical partner for these discussions. Arup are synonymous with leading engineering design, and as they aim to help shape a better world. Tonight, we're going to be taking stock ahead of the COP26 summit and what it needs to achieve. We will also be taking your questions. Now, to submit your questions, just type it into the live chat box to the right of the screen. You'll need to sign in if you haven't already done so and click on create a channel to join the chat. And then you can enter your name there. And if you've followed all those steps and you still can't really do anything, then just refresh the page and you'll be able to put your questions in. So do submit all the way through this evening's conversations, and then we'll bring them in as the conversation goes on, and we'll bring in as many as we can for our panel. We really want to hear from people listening to this from wherever you are in the world, because that's the only way this Ask the Engineers will genuinely be asking the engineers. So I'm joined by a fantastic panel tonight. Professor Sir Jim MacDonald is President of the Royal Academy of Engineering. He's also Principal and Vice Chancellor of the University of Strathclyde and co-chairs with the First Minister the Scottish Government's Energy Advisory Board. Dervilla Mitchell is Deputy Chair of Arup Group, and she chairs the National Engineering Policy Centre's Net Zero Working Group. Olivia Sweeney is a consultant at Resource Futures and part of the Academy's This is Engineering campaign. And we also have Tim Gould. He's the Chief Energy Economist at the International Energy Agency. So welcome to our panelists. And it's my pleasure to start asking you some questions first as we let everyone settle in and come up with their questions that we can bring in from the audience a bit later on. So let me ask you all on the panel. I'm going to ask you each to answer the key question for tonight. So the question is, what should COP26 aim to achieve? And I want to give each of you just 2 minutes to set out your stall. What do you think COP26 should aim to achieve? Professor Sir Jim MacDonald, why don't you go first?
Thanks, Alok, and I'm delighted to be speaking to you just 1 mile away from the blue and green zones of COP26, because I'm actually in my office in Glasgow just now. City is very excited, I have to say, and I'm particularly excited because I'm also hosting the Conference of Youth, which starts next week. I'll have 2,000 bright people coming to set up the agenda to take into COP26. Through COP26, Alok, I'd like to see a concerted effort and a collaborative effort to establish definite action to address climate change, effectively an international move, an agreed plan, a systems approach to understanding what has to be done in order to invest in and create a low regrets set of options, certainly over the next few years to 2030, so we can get started. I'd also like to have the community realise that the 2050 target simply won't be met without engineers. We have an enormous contribution to make. We translate scientific discoveries into real-world scalable inventions and innovations. We make things that work. And as engineers who work in rather thorny problems in the messy real world, we do apply systems thinking to complex challenges. And we have to take into account the whole of the problem. So there's no silver bullet, but we have to take that rigorous systems engineering approach to it. And the UK and our international partners have to achieve a more sustainable, stable and resilient energy system, one in which secure, affordable, low carbon energy is available to all. And this is a critical moment now that has to be grasped for a global society and an opportunity for the UK government to agree concrete global action. So I would conclude by saying it's 28 years or fewer than 1,500 weeks to 2050, a short time to make these changes needed. The UK government should lead by example and also show the commitments to rapid and coordinated action at scale. But COP26 must focus on getting international agreement on replacing incentives for nations to take high carbon energy strategies with incentives to innovate low carbon approaches. Thank you.
Jim, thank you so much. Thank you for keeping so succinctly to time too. Dervilla Mitchell, you're next. What do you think COP26 should aim to achieve?
I think COP26 has been really large in our mind, and particularly with the delay, we're very focused on COP26. And I think a lot of the expectations for COP have been around governments and political agreements. But I think COP needs to be more than that. It needs to be the catalyst which brings together governments, academia, and industry to collaborate and solve these very complex problems we face. And it also has to enable the right sort of solutions that can be invested in, and that there will also be public take-up. So I think probably most importantly is that we need COP to bring the world on board. We need people in every corner of the globe to understand this is a critical situation, and we need to support climate action. And so there are the big steps, political steps and regulatory steps, but there's also the steps that individuals need to take to make a difference. So I think it's a big ask for the conference to reach out and influence such a broad audience, but I'm optimistic as an individual and as an engineer because we thrive on complex problems. I'd also like to sort of support also Jim's words, which were around, this is a really big systems problem. We must use a systems approach to finding these solutions. Because otherwise we might have unintended consequences, and we don't want that to happen. And we need to integrate all the disciplines, and I think we'll talk about this more later on, but we need to integrate the engineering, the scientists, and the social sciences to get the solutions right. So I'm hoping COP will help bring all those different perspectives to the table.
Thank you, Dervilla. Olivia Sweeney, how about you? What do you think COP26 should aim to achieve? Olivia, you're muted, Olivia. There you go.
Apologies.
There you go, no problem.
Hi, I would echo what has been said before, but I would also add that COP26 needs to get it right. In a lot of ways, it feels like this is not the last COP, but the final COP where we have scope for change and mistakes. The recent IPCC report has said that there's still time to turn around the climate emergency. We're already feeling the effects, and as there's not going to be normality, I don't think, after this. But if we don't start to make those actions and changes now, it feels like those impacts will be even bigger, and we don't want to see that, not only for the UK but for countries around the world that are already seeing much more impact than we are. For me, the biggest thing that COP26 needs to achieve is equity, as well as justice. COP is not just about climate change and the environment, it's about making changes that are better for people and planet. It's about health, it's about making life easier and better for people. There's communities, it's still disproportionately communities around the world who are contributing the least, who are suffering the most, yet struggle to have their voices heard, may that be in the UK or in a global context. So I think COP needs to be pivotal in addressing this and leading by example in a lot of ways. As has been said, it needs to achieve global agreement, but I think key to that is accountability. We've had agreements before, but they haven't been followed up with accountability, and unless there's checking up in the weeks and years and months that follow COP, targets are never met. And I finally think COP should not be afraid of being critical of itself and the systems in which it functions and the limitations which this poses. As an engineer, I always know to work within my limits and bring on other people and other collaborators when needed. I'm not sure COP is the right or the only vehicle to create a just transition to net zero or whatever green sustainable future we want to see. So I think if we want to make change in the timescales that we need to be honest about that now, and bring on other bodies or other people if that's what's needed.
Thank you so much, Olivia. And last but not least, Tim, how about you? What do you think COP26 should aim to achieve?
Well, thanks very much, and it's a huge pleasure to join this distinguished group. especially as a non-engineer. But there's all sorts of formal answers to this question. I mean, there'll be various negotiations, technical negotiations on carbon markets and various sorts of international cooperative mechanisms. But I think when it boils down to it, COP26 needs to deliver three things. It needs to keep the door open to a stabilization in global average temperatures that recognizes the urgency of the issue. So that's 1.5 degrees. It needs to look not just at CO2, but also at other greenhouse gases like methane. And I think it needs to look not just at what governments are committing to now, because it's already clear that that's not going to be enough to get us to a 1.5 degree trajectory. But you need to have a process in place that keeps the momentum going and allows governments to ratchet up ambition afterwards. There's another set of issues that I think are critically important. That's the question of finance. There's a lot of discussion already about a commitment that dates back to more than a decade now from developed economies to provide climate finance for those developing countries. Looks like they may get close to this 100 billion figure in climate finance that has been committed to, but that is very much a floor, not a ceiling. So they need to have a vision on what happens from here. And I think more broadly, people are looking to COP for an unmistakable signal to investors, to people, that this is the right way to go, that this is where the opportunities for growth are, this is where opportunities for employment are, that this is a process. I mean, a little bit like Olivia was just saying, this is a process that makes sense for the planet, but also makes sense for people.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you to all our panelists for those introductory remarks. You've all raised lots and lots of the issues that I want to discuss for the next hour, and let's dig into some of those in a little more detail. We're looking to COP26 to set the framework for international global action. But how can the net zero targets actually be achieved? Let's look at that. Jim, I think Scotland has set even more challenging targets than even the UK government in general. How do you think Scotland? What's your sort of plan for how Scotland might meet those? I mean, why set such much higher targets?
Thanks, Alok. Well, as colleagues will know, the updated climate change plan is there from Scottish Government, and the decarbonisation plan is at 2045. And in many ways, Alok, the inspiration has been taken from work such as the Academy published just a few years ago and sent to the Prime Minister's Council for Science and Technology. So accelerating through late-stage R&D, investment, deployment, and understanding how these energy systems can be realised. The Academy suggested, and we continue to suggest through Dervilla and myself and others, that we need to undertake local or regional whole system large-scale pilot projects to establish real-world examples of how this can be achieved, and that must move beyond single technology demonstrations, useful as they may be, and incorporate all aspects of the energy system. Very importantly, and I think we've hinted at this already, including consumer behaviour, acceptance, and the financial mechanisms and economics. It can't be the engineering on its own, and drive forward towards new capacity in three main low-carbon areas. Of course, nuclear, there's a strategy and a politics piece around that in Scottish Government, but we sit inside a UK system and within a European system. Carbon capture and storage and offshore wind. So the big areas, and I'm happy to come on to them later in the discussion, Alok, is that we have to get projects moving. Decarbonising energy, whether it's offshore wind, wave and tidal energy, and a real opportunity to map in our subsea capabilities, working with the oil and gas industry to help them on their journey in that energy transition process, but capitalise on their investment capabilities, their balance sheet, because they can invest in projects alongside the public sector, and their skills. So the subsea sector driving that offshore wind, floating wind, as we might talk about, and there are many jobs and industries to be built there. And again, we can talk about the numbers there. And there are projects such as the hydrogen and carbon capture and utilisation project already up at Project Acorn at St Fergus. Also decarbonising heat. I mean, heat accounts for 52% of Scotland's energy demand, that some of you will be reminded about when you come up here for COP26. So we need to keep ourselves warm, and it's the single largest source of emissions in Scotland, around 41%. So decarbonising heat will be a crucial role in meeting Scotland's net zero targets, and we need to do this by accelerated deployment. And there are a number of our Academy Fellows who are driving that whole piece about energy efficiency and looking at the domestic market. Decarbonising transport key. The Mission Zero grand challenge, as Transport Scotland has said, is a big push there by 2030, phasing out the need for new petrol and diesel cars, phasing out the need for diesel buses by 2024. So a real challenge for public transport. And that, of course, rolls on to zero emissions, heavy duty vehicle programmes. So we're not short, Alok, of big plans. We're not short of, the whats and the whys. It's the hows and the whens that are going to be critical now. And as I would come back to just right at the start, that's where that engineering systems approach comes. And quite frankly, the risk capital and that low regrets evaluation of getting going on these projects. Some of it will work, some of it may not work. But if we learn how to do it better, then that allows us to engineer that future so much more effectively.
Thanks, Jim. And a real sort of tour of like the amazing projects that are going on in Scotland. You mentioned systems thinking again, and Dervilla, you said this in your introduction too. And I wonder if you might just help us understand, as people who aren't engineers, what does systems thinking mean, and how do you use it as engineers? And I guess the follow-up to that, which is, how does that then allow you to think positively and constructively about something like climate change?
Was that to me or to Jim?
Yes, to Dervilla. Yes, to you.
Okay.
You said systems thinking. I hope you can explain it.
Yeah. Well, I usually put up a tube map of London to explain systems thinking, in that a systems approach is a way of mapping all the connecting systems. And if you think a tube map of London, there's the people traveling through it, there's the trains, there's the tracks, there's the stations, and they all have to work together and in harmony for the system to work effectively. So that's, but what I think a systems approach is needed is because it allows you to see the whole of the problem. It allows you to understand the interfaces between different challenging areas, which might be it might be energy, as Jim has talked about, or it might be about housing. How are they connected? It allows you to look at scenarios and to look at levers and to think about what actions one might take and what might be the implications, and therefore it allows you to choose a better path going forward. I think also the thing about systems approach is it can be understood by everybody, not only engineers. And so I think that's an advantage to it. Is that enough for now? Probably.
Yes, it's very good. So the idea of thinking about how all the inputs and outputs sort of relate together, so it's not just one thing and that's it. It's a very complex. It's a very complex problem, isn't it? Tim, when we heard from so Jim just now about all the amazing projects going on in Scotland and the targets they've set themselves, it's kind of exciting to think about what's possible. So could you just give us a bit of a picture of what it's like around the world, and what other countries are leading the way, like Scotland, and how can countries help each other with technological solutions?
Yeah, I think this notion of technology leadership is incredibly important. But in practice, like determining who's leading the way on the response to climate change is quite actually a tricky question, because it gets to the heart of these questions of equity and responsibility that have briefly been mentioned before. And so there is this idea that I think actually this notion of net zero by 2050 is helpful in many ways, but it's unhelpful in one important way, is that it sets up this idea that there's a sort of new gold standard against which everyone is going to be measured, regardless of their state of development and their starting point. So our perspective is that that's not a particularly helpful way of looking at this, because countries really don't start in the same place on climate change, and they shouldn't be expected to finish at the same time. So advanced economies have to reach net zero well before many developing economies, and they have to help other countries to get there, because I mean, this is this is often referred to a race to net zero, but it's quite a unique sort of race in that no one really wins unless everyone crosses the line. So we get back to some of the things that Sir Jim was talking about, which is really, how can you deploy technologies, get the cost down, get the confidence up, have a system that is sufficiently open that these countries, different countries around the world, can benefit from the technology learnings taking place elsewhere. And I'd also strongly agree with this notion of the energy systems approach. That's unsurprising from our perspective at the International Energy Agency. But it's also true that we are creating a system in future. A net zero system is significantly more complex and integrated than the one we have now. At the moment, we have, it's slightly more complex than this, but you essentially have a set of unidirectional channels for delivery of oil, gas, electricity from sort of extraction, generation through networks to consumers. Now, the system in the future has to manage much more volatility just because of the nature of its component parts. And it's going to be tied together by all sorts of new, often digital systems that have to, in a sense, manage not just those unidirectional flows, but flows, many different conversions through batteries, in and out of low carbon hydrogen. So we need a set of pioneer countries and pioneer individuals that are really going to work out how that all fits together to enable others to follow down the same path.
Thank you, Tim. Olivia, where do consumers fit into all of this? It's an incredibly challenging problem for engineers, as we've heard. It's very challenging to work out how it all works from a sort of systems point of view. But given you study more of the policy and the data of all of this, what action from consumers will make a difference?
So consumers play a role, for sure. So as has been said, it's a system. And if we're looking at that tube map analogy, people travel around that system and are interacting with that system, and in some ways decide whether that system is worth it or not. If nobody traveled on the tube, that would be a massive waste of time and energy and money, and it wouldn't help solving the problem. So consumers are pivotal in the fact that a lot of technologies or new undertakings aren't user-friendly. And if they're not user-friendly or they're not conducive to life, they're not going to be used. So even if they may be net zero, the practicality of putting them in place and people uptaking them means that they might not be net zero. There was a Chris Stark quote that said, a lot of the technology and the ideas in order to overcome climate change already exist. It's just that people aren't taking them up because they either don't understand or they don't know that they're out there. So consumers in many ways are make or break. But the flip side of that is individual power. So individualization of the problem, I don't think is the way to go. There is an element of this need to design a better whole so that people can live a low carbon, zero carbon life without having to think about every step. We can't expect as individuals. I read up on all this stuff, so I know the carbon impact of the tomato I buy in the shop, or I can make the choice to not drive. But we can't expect every individual to be constantly calculating every one of those choices to see how it adds up. So there's this balance of they're vital to if the system works. But we shouldn't be expecting an individual choice to be made. And within my sector, I work within the waste sector, that shift is already starting to happen. So yes, it's on you to put your bottle into the right recycling bin, but it's up to us as system designers or policymakers to make sure that no matter if you're in Berkshire or Northampton, you've got the same colour bin so that you know that you're doing the right thing in different places so that it can always work. And if possible, we can push that towards the people who are producing the waste in the first place. So there's a piece of legislation called Extended Producer Responsibility, which is putting the onus of recycling that material on the manufacturer of it. So, for example, if it was a Coke bottle, it's Coke's responsibility to make sure that bottle throughout the whole system has minimal impact. So it's taking away an element of that responsibility from the consumer and the individual. So that's an answer that's a bit of everything, but I hope it's helpful.
That's very clear. Thank you, Olivia. And Dervilla, the commercial sector is going to be incredibly important in this. And I think that's what Olivia is hinting at, is that it can't all be up to individual consumers, because our actions, as much as we can do, aren't going to be as impactful as, say, for example, Arup, who is a huge construction company, can make some really important decisions about decarbonisation. Would you just give us a sense of how your sector, construction, is thinking about decarbonisation. It's one of the trickiest ones to decarbonise. What do you think needs to happen for companies and organisations and sectors like yours?
Yeah, there is no doubt that the construction sector is a very traditional, well-established sector. And I think one of the first things is just to recognise the significant and rapid transformation is going to be required. We cannot continue to build as we have done and reach net zero by 2050. So there's a piece from the World Green Building Council has said, that buildings and infrastructure around the world can reach 40% less embodied carbon by 2030. But this can be only achieved through urgent transformation. Much has been done, but more needs to be done. And I would say there's three things that I'd like to mention tonight, which are important. First of all, measurement. Today, less than 1% of building projects in the UK currently calculate their full carbon footprint. So we need to start measuring this full carbon footprint, both the embodied and operational carbon of all real estate assets. This would make us much more aware of the impact we're having. And we must come to a stage where we consider carbon in the same way we consider cost. We'd never build a building without thinking about cost. We'd never operate a building without thinking about cost. We must consider carbon in that sort of way. And to do that, we need to get consistent and transparent carbon measurement embedded in the industry. And I think we can connect to this meeting afterwards also a couple of reports. One is the NEPC report on decarbonising construction, which talks about 4 different missions, everything from the product, I have to look at my notes, the design and specification, construction and reuse, to how we procure things. And so the second thing I would say is around, big thing I think is to think around is procurement, and it has a huge role to play. So we need to move from buying purely on cost to considering outcome-based procurement, where we buy that transformation to our greener future. Whether we're a government or we're an individual, we can all play a role in making the difference when we choose how to spend our money. And the third thing I would say, it sounds simple, but challenge ourselves and our clients on the need to build new and consider how buildings can be in part or wholly reused. That would make a big difference. So 3 things there. Thanks.
Thank you, Dervilla. And just a reminder to the audience, as you can submit questions. I can see that we already have. Please do submit questions and I'll put them to the panel very shortly. A few more from me before we go to those questions. Jim, we talk a lot about new technologies and how Dervilla's just talked about, making sure that we understand the carbon impact of things, and we need to discuss with consumers how to go about maybe being more understanding of their carbon and footprints. But the technologies, of course, also give us new economic opportunities as well. They're not just there to make us feel good as well. So can you just run us through some of those? I know that you see that there's some big economic opportunities with some new technologies. Can you give us some examples?
Sure, thanks, Alok. And I always like to reference a good friend of the Academies, and that's Lord Nick Stern. And Nick's report some 15 years ago, the eponymous Stern report, talked about the economics of climate change, but of course the need for research, innovation, that just transition, but also how we build economic opportunities. We do that, jobs, new industries, new markets. So we should bear that in mind. And I love what Olivia was saying there as well. I think you mentioned, in fact, Tim, you mentioned the digitalisation. National Grid, just keeping it to electrical systems. I'm an electrical engineer. They talk about the 3 Ds of achieving net zero, and that's decarbonisation, of course, digitalisation, because we should be using that to control, manage and automate, and decentralisation. And we'll see that, I think, in the coming decades in the industrialised nations. And to Tim's point, then we need to make sure that we invest in, support and work with our colleagues that are developing economies to make sure they take advantage of these technological advances. So just a couple here, Alok. Just a couple of months ago, I produced a report that was commissioned by the Scottish Government to see if we could keep more of that offshore wind economic value in Scotland and in the UK. Quite frankly, we haven't over the past decade. In Scotland alone, we anticipated about 10 years ago that we would have 10 gigawatts of offshore wind and about 10,000 jobs. We, in fact, ended up with less than 1,000 jobs and just over 1 gigawatts of deployment. So we need to think how we do that. So technological advances, we're losing out to our colleagues in France and Holland and indeed the Far East. So floating wind is now a very promising means by which we can extract even more wind. And in so doing, we can capitalise on that subsea capability from oil and gas, invest in Scotland's ports, somewhere in the order of about £500 million in Nigg and Cromarty. There's already major investments going on in Aberdeen, Dundee and Leith. And back to the point I made earlier, Alok, rather than us having internal competition, work with our colleagues in the Humber, see that UK as a system that's seeking to address that offshore wind opportunity, build jobs, etc. So in Scotland alone, the report identified about £1.5 billion worth of opportunity over the next 3 or 4 years if, through the ScotWind leasing arrangement, we can get about 10 gigawatts of release from the Crown Estate, and about 2/3 of that we anticipated to be in the floating side of things. That should stabilise around about 3,000 jobs per annum for the next 30 years, peaking at about 6,000 jobs. Now, if by 2030, and remember we've got the Prime Minister's 10-point plan in the UK that sits behind this, if we can achieve that, then that's only about 5% of the world's market for floating wind. So here we are, typical Stern economics, in addressing our decarbonisation of electricity generation. There's a whole range of other things that I won't drop you into, but subsea grid and looking at the great Irish company, I would point you towards Supernode that Dervilla might know, that's imagining the pan-European grid interconnectivity. We've got a chance to build real opportunity. So, and there are other activities as well. In Dundee, on the previous site of the Michelin activity, we've got a programme called Locate, which is taking a whole systems approach to hydrogen for transport. So seeing that from grid to transport to supply, and also seeing how hydrogen can be used for high temperature applications for industrialisation and decarbonisation there. So the message I would say is lots of big projects, but all taking a systems approach. And I would commend you to have a look at Project Orion in Shetland, where BP, Shell, SSE, and offshore wind companies are trying to decarbonise the island by 2030, and to the point that Olivia's made throughout this evening, bring the citizens of the island with us, have them co-create, engage, and then understand how they can use the technology that comes from it.
Thanks, Jim. Tim, can I ask you, your organisation publishes the World Energy Outlook, and in fact the latest edition came out last week. So you're trying to understand the use of energy around the world and how it's changing. Energy being such an important part of the decarbonisation plan for around the world. Just building on what Jim said there, do you think there's now a global business imperative for change and decarbonisation?
I'd like to, echo something that Jim was talking about, because there's clearly a massive opportunity there. So we tried to put some numbers on it in the new Outlook and try to understand what this new global energy economy might look like. And we looked at the market opportunity for manufacturers of a selected number of equipment types. So solar PV modules, wind turbines, onshore and offshore, electrolyzers, lithium-ion batteries, and fuel cells. And we wanted to try and see what's the market size for those 5 bits of equipment that are obviously essential to a low emission system. And by 2050, if we reach a 1.5 degree trajectory, the market size there for those 5 items is over $1 trillion per year. Now that's roughly the size of today's oil market. And the oil market, of course, comes with natural resource rents, which contribute to the size of that. So let's be clear, there's a really massive opportunity there for those that take the leap and into this new energy economy. There is, though, a caveat. Jobs are created, many more jobs are created than those that are lost, but there will be dislocation. So governments need to manage that. And they need to do exactly what Sir Jim was talking about, identify the opportunities the technology opportunities that correspond to existing skill sets, or identify the skills that are missing, and allow then communities and others to navigate that process with a degree of foresight. And then, of course, help over the long term to manage the social and economic consequences for those who are in sectors that decline.
Thank you very much, Tim. Well, I'm going to move on to audience questions now, because we've already got quite a few, and I'd like to obviously give our audience access to you, your brains as experts. So I'm going to start going through those now. Just to remind you, remind the audience, you can submit questions in the live chat box on the right of your screen. So you'll need to sign in if you haven't done so already, and click on Create a Channel to join the chat to enter your name. Once you've done all of that, you might need to refresh to rejoin the page. Now, we look forward to answering as many questions as possible, so let's begin. And I remember a big quick reminder to the panel as well. I'm going to direct some questions to the people I think that might be able to answer them, but of course you're all welcome to jump in with anything. So do put your hand up if you want to say something. Okay, question number one from the audience. What's unique about the opportunities of COP26? What have we got the chance to achieve now that we haven't had before? What's unique about COP26? Jim, I reckon this is a question that you could probably have a go at.
Well, I'd like to think that the air in Glasgow is going to encourage cooperation, goodwill and friendship, because we need to remember the very important emotive aspect of trust and confidence is key here. And I know that Mr. Alok Sharma has been very much involved in shuttle diplomacy ahead of the Paris Agreement. His counterpart spent an awful lot longer because they had more time just to garner that political engagement. And it's all felt, albeit delayed, rather rushed latterly. But that having been said, what I think is the drive here, well, I hate to use the analogy, but the burning bridge has burned for a little bit longer since the last time COP met. We have even less time to do this. We have even more data with the IPCC report only 6 to 9 months ago about letting us understand the impact of man on the planet. And I'd like to think the increasing pressure, the positive pressure we're getting, not just from the young people in society, but increasingly now the awakening that this is not a nice to do, but a must do. It seems to me we've got a mixture of positive pressures of the benefit of building economy and nations doing the right thing together, but we've also got the negative pressure of we have less and less time to do the right thing. And forgive me for looping back again, Alok. That's why that understanding driven by these system models that Dervilla has talked about, working respectfully with government and working in a way that creates the right investment environment, and very importantly, takes our duty of care and communication with society very seriously. So let's not lecture people, let's bring them forward. And I would say that a hectoring approach to we must do often doesn't work. I'm a great believer that the most sustainable fuel is optimism. So let's make sure we tell the story all the more effectively and have people engage and want to be part of that future.
Thanks, Jim. That's very optimistic and energizing to hear all of that. And unless any of the rest of the panel want to just add their 2 cents to that, I'll move on to the next question. Here's the next question. Could the use of the Internet of Things contribute to reduction of carbon emissions and reduce the severe impacts of climate change? So the Internet of Things, this is the idea that every object around you has an IP address and can be controlled from anywhere in the world. There's some idea that by being able to be much more smart and flexible about how these things use energy, perhaps I guess that we could make some impacts on climate change. I wonder if one of you would like to take that. Dervilla, is there a role for the Internet of Things?
Yeah. I'm no expert on the Internet of Things, but technology and the digital world are going to play a really important part in enabling us to be much more connected and therefore to be more efficient and to understand how the system works. So I think the answer to that question is a clear yes. But we're going to have to open up on things like data. How are we going to share data in a way rather than weaponizing it, to make sure that the right data helps us to make the right decisions, helps us to operate what has already been referred to as a more complex system. The world we're going to live in is going to be much more complex. So I think yes, and lots to do in terms of regulation and management to make that happen.
Yeah. Okay. Another question here. What needs to be done to implement a global system of taxation on high carbon emitters? In other words, for example, cement production. Companies need to be incentivized to switch to low carbon innovations. We've kind of touched on a few of these issues already, I feel, but I suppose the questioner is trying to ask about the changing the incentives to continue being a high carbon industry. Tim, I wonder if you might have some thoughts on this. How do we recreate incentives? I mean, this is what economists always talk about, is what are the best incentives for things? And part of the reason perhaps we've been slower than we might like in moving the world towards a low carbon future is that the incentives for fossil fuel production are still quite high.
Yeah, I think that's right, and that's why the classical economics response to this question is to talk about carbon pricing, and the IEA is very much in favor of putting a price on externalities. I think we need to be aware, though, that there are multiple market failures in the way that we're managing our climate, and pricing is one of them. And if you want to take and so carbon pricing can do some things, but it can't do everything. And I think the cement industry is really quite a good example of an industry where you don't just need incentives to use mature technologies that are available today. You need to bring some new approaches into the market. And that's going to require more than just a price on carbon. That's going to require some careful balancing between the interests of businesses, governments, other stakeholders. You're going to need people who are interested in low emission cement. You're going to need an end user who's willing to pay a premium for that at some point, or someone's going to have to cover the cost of that in an initial phase. So it gets back to something that, at least in our view, is very important when we think about the agenda for the 2020s. We have some mature technologies that are ready for the big time. So we need to just scale those up as quickly as we can. And wind and solar are good examples of that, but there's a whole host of efficient technologies that could be rolled out more rapidly. At the same time, we need to recognize that while we have some of the tools we need, we don't have all of the tools we need. And the area where we're deficient is precisely in some of these heavy industrial sectors and in long distance transport. And that's why, alongside that deployment effort at scale, we need to have an R&D and technology learning effort for those areas. And looking at technologies like advanced batteries, looking at elements of the low carbon hydrogen value chain, looking at elements of carbon capture, utilization and storage, that need to be proven, but the business models at least need to be proven, and costs in some cases need to come down. And I think the cement industry is a prime candidate for that, because the emissions from cement are significant. They are not something that you can just solve with low carbon electricity. There are process emissions there, which are also very tricky. It's a good candidate for carbon capture, but you need to make sure those incentives and that the deployment and that needs to happen now in order for it to be ready to scale up in the 2030s as well.
Thanks, Tim. Olivia, I wonder if you can give your perspective on this as well. How do we change the incentives to make sure that that decarbonisation is something that the industry takes seriously?
Yeah, so Tim touched on it there when talking about process emissions, and I think it's really key that we think about things as a whole. And we've said that a lot throughout this with systems thinking, but it comes out again here where we need to think about what we're placing value on and what we're measuring. So if you measure things like social impact, if you measure things like other forms of environmental impact, may that be use of land, deforestation, other things than carbon, if you add those into a whole, may that be adding a financial value to it, like with a carbon tax, or may that be looking at a different model of measurement, something like donut economics, which takes all those things to account and plots it on a donut graph. You're going to make different choices because you're measuring different things, and you are looking at things in a systems approach and not just measuring the carbon impact or the financial impact. You're looking at the social, the human, the economic, all those other impacts. So I think that's really key in changing the way we think about things. So therefore, you don't necessarily need to change the incentive, though it would be nice if people just did things because they were good for the planet. You are measuring things differently, so what comes out as the winner is different against those measures anyway. If you're measuring things differently and measuring the whole much more. Let's
Olivia. Yeah, it would be nice if everyone just did it for the happiness of it all, but that's not going to happen, is it? Now, let's move on to another question. Does the panel think that we should be sending the message that technology will enable the targets for net zero to be made without individuals having to make compromises on their current lifestyles? This is an interesting question, because what I'm trying to say is that if we talk about technology solutions to everything, then does it take the onus off individuals? I suppose there's different ways of answering this question. Dervilla, maybe I can start with you. Do you think that the positivity we have about technology, and which we've expressed consistently in this conversation so far, does that take the onus off individuals and let them relax?
I hope it does not, because I think this is one of these not either or conversations, but and. Government needs to take action, industry needs to take action, academia needs to help us, individuals need to take action. And we also need to think about taking action now for these rapid changes. So what can we do today without this new technology? What can we actually change today? What can we develop and use, in the coming short number of years, say 5-7 years, and then think about the technology and the advancing technology to deal with the harder long-term problems. So let's just keep going and take some personal responsibility.
So everyone has to take some responsibility. Jim, did you want to add something to do?
To the person that quoted the question, it's a mixture of all of these things. Of course, it's technology solutions. I think Tim and Fred, and I agree with them. Much of the immediate solutions will be of existing technology, so it's about integrating and building at scale, and of course keep the research and innovation investment going behind that. But just with regard to citizen engagement, Alok, and I tie this back to the city that's hosting COP26. 10 years ago, I was involved in setting up an entity pretty self-explanatory called Sustainable Glasgow, and it's got real energy behind it now in terms of preparation for COP26. 4 big themes, all of which includes the citizens of Glasgow to help them engage with it. Green infrastructure and transport, great consultation and involvement with local communities. Housing and heating, where we have a particular challenge in terms of poverty and deprivation. So we need to bear that in mind. The just transition that Olivia has mentioned before, let us not just concentrate on how we can afford these things. There are many in society who cannot afford, so we have to build and include and inform, and also greening the city through our parks, the green spaces, and the green economy and private sector, because this cannot be done by the public sector alone. It has to be the public sector with private sector behind it, and I think Tim's touched on that. But fundamental to this is from the micro to the personal to the macro, and that's eminently suitable for systems thinking. But we as responsible citizens have to demonstrate by our actions. And again, I'm very excited about having 2,000 relatively young people come tell me what they think about decarbonisation next week.
Thanks, Jim. And Tim, did you want to add something quick to this as well?
Yeah, just very quickly. I mean, we divided up, if we looked at all of the emission savings that you need to get to net zero by 2050, and found that about 40%, in a sense, don't really impinge on the lives of consumers at all, because they happen upstream. It's the way that the electricity is generated or something else. The majority, though, require some sort of buy-in from consumers, either because they're buying something different, they're using a piece of equipment differently, they're installing a heat pump in their home or something like that. And then there's a small additional element which is around material efficiency and behavioral change, which actually reduces energy service demand because you're just behaving differently from the way you were previously. But so there is an absolutely essential element of consumer engagement in this process, and it has to be managed through a very transparent and open dialogue about what's happening and why it needs to happen.
Thank you very much. We've got 8 minutes before we have to wind up, so I'd like to rattle through some more of the audience questions. There's so many, and it'd be good to sort of fire them all at you. So I'm going to ask, almost in a quick fire way, to one panelist each, if that's okay with you. And if you really want to say something on top of that, then please go ahead. So I want to go through the question here. If China keeps building coal-fired power stations, is there anything we do is irrelevant, says this questioner. Why bother the risk to our economy? And related to that, another question is, does it matter if the leaders of some of the world's most populous nations, China, Russia, Brazil, India, do not attend COP26 if many other leaders have already confirmed? This is a really good political question, which I want to point towards Jim. What happens? Why bother if China's going to build loads of coal-fired power stations? And does it matter that some of the biggest countries in the world are not coming?
Well, of course, I do think it matters if they don't show, Alok, and it says as much about the countries that don't come to be represented as it does about the system itself. That having been said, let's judge that in a couple of weeks' time once we're in the throes of the conference. So I'm delighted to say that I have the pleasure of hosting and chairing a joint UK-China working group on decarbonisation. The Royal Academy of Engineering set up a number of workshops. Dervilla and I were involved in that with industry, both in China and in the UK, and senior academics and indeed policymakers from the Department of Energy, from the Ministry of Science and Technology in China. And we've committed to sharing our views on how one decarbonises. The 2060 plan in China, and I know, Tim, dates can be meaningful or not, but nonetheless, we're now getting dates quoted from the Chinese government, which I think is forward movement. Premier Li Keqiang talks a lot about getting rid of coal out of China by, I think it's the peak coal will be about 2035, and then an expansion in wind, and nuclear is likely to be there as well. But if they continue to build coal, actions speak louder than words. We need to see that system coming forward. But for me, it's critically important we keep the dialogue going. It's critically important we keep sharing, and it's critically important that we intellectually challenge. And whilst we get geopolitical machinery running around us, the exchange of research ideas about looking to the future is one way of ensuring that we work in harmony. But of course, I'll be disappointed if there are very significant names that aren't here in Glasgow in a couple of weeks' time. Thank
you. Olivia, this one's for you, I think. Do initiatives like the Earthshot Prize paint too simplistic a picture of the challenge of climate change? It all looks very glossy, and someone wins £1 million to develop an idea. Just as a reminder, the Earthshot Prize is an initiative fronted by Prince William, amongst others, that aims to generate new ideas, technological ideas for solving climate change. Olivia, what do you think of it?
What do I think of it? I think it has its place. Oh, the light's just gone off in my room because I've been sat still too long.
Okay, we can see you.
I think there's a place for it, but I don't think it's the overall solution. I think there's a piece around engagement and allowing individuals and people who might not normally have the opportunity to create change to be part of that. So £1 million is a massive amount of money for someone to develop that technology. So that is valuable regardless. And it appeals to an audience and it allows access and conversation starters around that. There needs to be a balance though. If that's all that Prince William is doing, if that's all that the royal family is doing, the only questions that they're asking themselves, that is a limitation. So there's this thing of, yes, there's a value in it and serving a purpose, but it's not the end, it's the beginning of something. And there's plenty of negative, as Jim spoke about earlier, there's plenty of negative around climate change and actions for climate, and there's plenty of sacrifice and suffering. So if it serves as that balance, because you need both the carrot and the stick in this process.
Okay, we have 4 minutes left, so that's good because there's 4 of you, so 1 minute each to answer this very final question, which is a really good one. what is the speaker's message to the next generation? So what would your two-sentence message be to the next generation? Tim, I'm sorry to put you on the spot, but you have so much of the data that we need to understand this. So what is your message to the next generation?
I hope it's not just, I'm sorry, because at the moment we are well off track to do anything that is immediately meaningful about the change. And so we added up all of the pledges that have been made in advance of Glasgow. They point to a world of warming well above 2 degrees Celsius. And anyone who's familiar with the physical science report that was produced by the IPCC a few months ago recognizes that there's a big difference between 2 degrees and 1.5. Of course, it's better than where we were heading before, but there's an awful lot more to be done.
And Dervilla, how about you?
My message to the next generation would be to see this climate challenge as an opportunity. So embrace this. Look for the purposeful job you can do. Look at how you personally can make a difference, because I think if everyone makes a bit of a difference together, we will meet this challenge.
Dervilla? Oh, sorry, you've just answered that. I'm sorry. Olivia, how about you? What would you say as your message to the next generation?
I think my message would be don't be limited by the thinking and the way that things are today. I asked myself why 5 times. So why is China building those coal power stations? It's not like they're building them for no reason. The actions that we're taking are influencing the need to generate that power. So ask why, see what actions you can take, and don't be limited by the systems that we're in today, and don't feel like you need to be siloed into solutions. As we've said, it's about system thinking, and that's not just an engineering system. That's a global system, and that's a system where politics, engineering, the arts, history are learning and feeding off each other. So don't be individual, be collaborative in your approach.
Thank you, Olivia. And it feels appropriate that we give the last words to Jim. What's your message for the next generation?
Well, I message every day, Alok, because my 3 kids are engineers, all working in the engineering and energy domain, so they hold me to account. So I message the following, and I'd like to amplify it, that our generation, as it were, are committed to facilitate, educate and invest in you. And you are the leaders that will create the low carbon future that we so desperately need. And finally, please work with us to make that a reality.
Thank you so much, Jim. Well, unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. We have so many more questions that we just couldn't get to, which shows you the strength of feeling in the members of the public out there. But we will pick this discussion up again on Wednesday, the 3rd of November, 2021 at 12 noon GMT. And we're going to be talking about green skills and asking how to equip the next generation to achieve net zero. You can see how to register in the chat now. There's also a link in the chat to a brief follow-up survey of this event. This link will also be shared in an email. Thank you very much for your feedback in advance. It'd be very helpful to help us make these events more relevant in the future. Now, it just remains for me to thank our excellent panel today for answering all your questions. Jim, Dervilla, Olivia and Tim, thank you for getting us ready for COP26. Thank you also to the Academy, and see you all again on the 3rd of November, which also, by the way, happens to be This is Engineering Day, which is a day to celebrate the impact of engineers and engineering. So thank you all for joining us, and see you again very soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.